crude authoritarianism. Unlike traditional approaches that treat law as either a source of eternal moral truth or as simply the command of whoever holds power, Machiavellian legal theory examines how legal institutions interact with other political forces to create stability, legitimacy, and effective governance. His insights about the political functions of law, the relationship between legal and extra-legal authority, and the conditions under which legal institutions strengthen or weaken political order continue to influence constitutional theory, comparative legal studies, and debates about the rule of law in developing countries. But his analysis also reveals the inherent limitations of purely legal approaches to political problems and demonstrates why effective governance requires more than simply establishing good laws and expecting them to enforce themselves. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in legal reform, constitutional design, or institutional development in contexts where formal legal institutions must compete with alternative sources of authority and legitimacy. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian legal analysis extends to ongoing debates about international law, corporate governance, and various forms of regulatory policy, where similar tensions between legal formalism and practical effectiveness operate. The foundation of Machiavellian legal theory rests on his observation that legal institutions derive their effectiveness not from their moral authority or logical consistency, but from their relationship to underlying patterns of political power and social acceptance. Laws that conflict with basic power relationships will be ignored or violated regardless of their formal status, while laws that reinforce existing power patterns may be followed even when they lack moral legitimacy. This means that effective legal reform requires attention to political and social conditions that make legal compliance possible and beneficial rather than simply drafting better legal texts and expecting them to change behavior automatically. Legal institutions work best when they codify and systematize behavioral patterns that people are already motivated to follow for independent reasons, rather than when they attempt to impose completely new behavioral requirements against existing incentives and preferences. This insight helps explain why legal transplantation often fails when legal institutions developed in one society are imported into different social and political contexts without adequate attention to local conditions. It also explains why formal legal equality may not translate into substantive equality when underlying social and economic conditions create systematic advantages for particular groups. The relationship between legal and extra-legal sources of political authority illustrates one of the most important insights in Machiavellian political analysis. Even the most developed legal systems cannot address every possible situation that political leaders might face, which means that effective governance always requires some capacity for extra-legal action during emergencies or unprecedented circumstances. Leaders who confine themselves strictly to legal procedures may find themselves unable to respond effectively to genuine crises that threaten the survival of the political system itself. But leaders who too frequently resort to extra-legal authority may undermine the legitimacy and effectiveness of legal institutions that provide predictability and constraint during normal periods. The challenge involves developing judgment about when circumstances genuinely require extra legal action and ensuring that such action strengthens rather than weakens legal institutions over the long term. This requires sophisticated understanding of the relationship between emergency powers and constitutional government that continues to challenge democratic societies during national security crises, economic emergencies, and public health disasters. Modern examples include wartime executive powers, central bank independence during financial crises, and various forms of administrative discretion that allow governmental agencies to adapt formal rules to specific circumstances. The goal is not to eliminate all extra legal authority, which would make effective governance impossible, but rather to ensure that extra legal actions serve legitimate public purposes and that they operate within broader frameworks of accountability and constraint. The political functions of legal institutions extend far beyond their formal role in resolving disputes and punishing violations to include broader contributions to social coordination, legitimacy building and power management. Legal procedures provide predictable mechanisms for resolving conflicts that might otherwise explode in violence or political instability. They also create common frameworks for understanding rights, obligations, and behavioral expectations that facilitate complex social and economic interactions among strangers. Perhaps most importantly, legal institutions provide alternative pathways for political influence that can channel opposition and ambition in constructive directions rather than forcing dissatisfied groups to choose between submission and rebellion. These political functions of law may be more important than their technical legal functions for maintaining overall political stability and effectiveness. Legal institutions that serve these broader political purposes effectively may retain legitimacy and influence even when their formal legal outputs are imperfect or inconsistent. Conversely, legal institutions that function well technically but fail to serve broader political functions may find themselves marginalized or ignored during periods of political stress. Understanding these multiple functions helps explain why legal reform efforts often produce unexpected results and why successful institutional development requires attention to political and social dynamics rather than simply technical legal considerations. The relationship between legal formalism and practical effectiveness creates ongoing tensions in constitutional design and legal reform that Machiavellian analysis helps illuminate. Formal legal clarity provides predictability and constraint that benefits both governmental officials and private citizens by creating stable expectations about behavioral consequences. But excessive formalism may prevent necessary adaptation to changing circumstances and may create opportunities for technical manipulation that serves narrow interests rather than broader public purposes. Meanwhile, flexible legal standards that allow adaptation to specific circumstances may provide better practical outcomes, but may also create uncertainty and opportunities for arbitrary action that undermine legal legitimacy. The optimal balance between formalism and flexibility depends on specific contexts and institutional capabilities, but it always involves trade-offs between different values and objectives that cannot be reconciled perfectly. Modern examples include debates about constitutional interpretation, administrative law standards, and international legal frameworks that must accommodate diverse national legal systems and political cultures. Machiavellian analysis suggests that these tensions cannot be resolved through purely legal reasoning, but require ongoing political judgment about how legal institutions can best serve broader purposes of effective governance and social cooperation. The goal is not to achieve perfect legal systems, which is impossible, but rather to design legal institutions that work well enough to support other political and social institutions while adapting to changing circumstances over time. The enforcement dimension of legal effectiveness reveals how legal institutions depend on broader political and social systems for their practical impact on behavior. Laws without enforcement are merely suggestions that may be ignored when compliance conflicts with individual interests or social pressures. But enforcement requires institutional capabilities and political will that may not exist independently of the legal system itself, creating potential circular dependencies where legal effectiveness depends on political conditions that legal institutions are supposed to create. This enforcement challenge becomes particularly acute in contexts where state capacity is limited, where social norms conflict with legal requirements, or where legal institutions lack legitimacy among significant portions of the population. Effective legal systems must therefore develop enforcement strategies that work within existing political and social constraints, while gradually building the institutional capabilities necessary for more comprehensive legal compliance over time. This might involve selective enforcement that focuses on the most important legal requirements, graduated sanctions that provide incentives for voluntary compliance, or various forms of community-based enforcement that harness social pressures to support legal objectives. Modern examples include community policing programs, regulatory approaches that emphasize cooperation rather than punishment, and international legal regimes that rely primarily on reputation and reciprocity rather than centralized enforcement mechanisms. Understanding these enforcement dynamics helps explain why formal legal reform often produces disappointing results and why successful institutional development requires sustained attention to implementation processes rather than simply legislative or constitutional drafting. Part 16.
What the fuck?
Popular opinion and the manipulation of public sentiment. The relationship between political leadership and public opinion represents one of the most complex and morally ambiguous aspects of Machiavellian political analysis, revealing deep insights about democratic legitimacy, mass psychology, and the conditions under which popular government can function effectively. Unlike traditional approaches that either idealize popular wisdom or dismiss mass opinion as inherently irrational, Machiavellian analysis examines the specific circumstances under which public sentiment supports or undermines effective governance. His insights about crowd psychology, political communication, and the manipulation of public opinion anticipate modern theories of media influence, electoral behavior, and propaganda that remain central to contemporary political science and democratic theory. But his analysis also raises disturbing questions about the compatibility between honest government and popular support that continue to challenge democratic societies around the world. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in democratic politics, whether as leaders, activists, or citizens who must navigate the tension between responsive governance and effective governance in complex modern societies. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian opinion analysis extends to ongoing debates about social media, political polarization, and various forms of information warfare that exploit the same psychological mechanisms that he identified centuries ago. The foundation of Machiavellian opinion analysis rests on his observation that popular political judgment operates according to different psychological mechanisms than expert analysis or individual decision-making. Large groups of people respond primarily to immediate, visible, and emotionally compelling information rather than to complex arguments about long-term consequences or technical policy details. This means that effective political communication must appeal to popular psychological tendencies, rather than assuming that citizens will engage in the kind of careful deliberation that democratic theory often assumes. Popular opinion tends to be volatile, responding quickly to dramatic events, but losing interest when problems become routine or when solutions require sustained effort without immediate results. It also tends to be retrospective, evaluating leaders based on outcomes rather than intentions, and attributing complex social phenomena to simple, causal explanations that may or may not reflect actual reality. These psychological tendencies are not flaws that can be corrected through better civic education. but rather fundamental features of how large groups process political information that effective leaders must understand and accommodate.
Došlo mi.
The moral paradox of popular
Hitalaj.
leadership involves the tension between telling citizens what they want
To
to
je sinoć
hear
govore da se
and telling
napustili
them
ko
what
šta
they
vi
need
sad.
to know for effective
Ko?
self-governance.
Otišao u svoj klan, boli me
Democratic
briga.
theory assumes that informed citizens can make good collective decisions
Da
about
ću je briga.
complex policy issues.
Došlo mi
But
tako.
Machiavellian analysis suggests
Kažeš tek sinoć primijetili posle 2 dana, jel?
may undermine the popular
Pa ja
support
sinoć vidio, nisam
necessary
bio
for
tu.
effective leadership.
Što nisi bio tu?
Citizens may prefer comforting illusions about easy
Nema obaveza.
A, onda u redu.
Ma tu mi je kum, a sinoć išao i naslavu i praksu.
Ma debola, ne, samo opušteno znam. Šta god bilo je.
Ma,
Samo lagano.
pa sinoć kad sam se vratio kući ušao malo, ovi kažu Nenad otišao, to je Nenad.
Ma onako malo došlo mi. Ljebe, dragi, znači...
Je li da bi je referala?
A?
Je li da li je referala uradiš?
Ma, završio sam referale.
Aha.
Završio sam ih. Nije problem to, nego sam počeo američki referal. Dečak, znači, bože. Snajpam, ali nema niko da ga pogodi. KV1. Joj, ne mogu da se namjestim nikako.
Na koliko strana svijeta imaš akaunta?
Ma na sve strane svijeta. Na sve strane svijeta imam, no šta će. Ako dođem tamo opet daleko pa da mi ne valja mi ovdje onaj ping, onda mogu da igram tamo, mogu ovako onako.
Ja.
Boli me briga. A i nije mi zanimljivo više ovdje, znači dođem, odigram sat vremena ovako ujutro i posle toga nemam ono puta 5 da iskoristim od premium naloga, nemam ništa drugo da dobijam više i dobijam minimalac i onda mi se ne daje mi se ništa da igram. I onda krenuo tamo da se zjebam, našao sam nekog komanda sam našao. Pa me pa rješavam i tamo. Čisto da se nečim zanima malo. Malo sad odigram ovdje evropski, pa onda kasnije odo na doručak i poslije toga odo malo američkoga da odigramo im tamo malo. Pošto sam ova 2 referala završio za 40 dana, mislim da je 40 dana restart. Tako negdje otprilike 40 dana, pa mogu još 2 referala da udarim. I zanimljivije mi je tako da igram te referale nego ovo. Jer tamo se kao ovdje se pazim vamo, a tamo se ponašam kod životinje, znači zaletim se, izginem, idem dalje. A ovdje pazi, ovo, ono, nešto tamo, budem fin. A?
A moraš raditi što više da napraviš što bolje.
Ba ja. Tamo se zaletim, ubijem 2 čovjeka, znači duelistom medalju uzmem sa heavyjem ako uspijem i to mi super onda. 10 poena idem brže malo. Ako bude još to šta nešto super odlično, ako ne bude, ne bude. Ako dobijem plus 2 matchmaking, znači 7 na 9, dezerter, ćao zdravo. I boli me briga. Samo izađe. Je to, heavy Karelia, znači, nisam ja ovo, ovako, heavy Karelia, ubiše ga na otvorenome. Debilana, od starta znači krene debilana.
Pa dobro.
Ba joj, šta da se radi, znači nema šta, debila ima. Znaš šta kaže, malo prije sam pročitao vijest. Kaže, inženjeri prave kantu za smeće. Kaže da bude dovoljno jednostavna za majmune, debile, kretene. Evo ga još jedan KVNSA, znači ide po sredini. Da bude dovoljno jednostavna za debile, da znaju koristiti i da bude komplikovana za medvjede u divljini, znači da oni ne mogu otvoriti. Ja rekao, Bože. Šta je, kad je prije prešao tamo, kako ne mogu da ga nišem? Katastrofa. Aj, vrati se nazad malo. Vrati se nazad ili naprijed, ne kreni negdje. Nemo tu, neki mi kamen smeta. Evo ga, sunce. Otkud? Da, ti.
Jel tu imaš mali lag?
A?
Jel tu imaš mali lag?
Imam. Da ću, koristim drugi laptop i slabiji. Ne znam, nešto ga muči. I sad ako uspijem pobjeći, bit će dobro. Ali ima, znači, loše, ne može sve da podnese.
Vidim.
Skakut će mi FPS, znači, nekada bude 150, pa padne na 20, 30.
Samo.
Došao Lajtić pod bubrege.
I laganica.
Ma kako laganica, znači patnja živa.
Sad će ti XFM.
A?
Sad će ti XFM.
Pa čisto da zna se koliko je vrijeme. Još gar piše 8:45.
No.
Kako bi bilo da ga aha, čovjek ga iza leđa iskasapi. Ali, znaš što je bitno? Bitno je da je Valiant došao do naše baze i da ga niko nije mogao spotati. To je malo bitnija stavka. A Valiant je znači najbrži tank u igri.
Ovo je bilo. Zati je došao da ga niko ne može spatiti.
Da. A ja ovo imam tankića, znači, koji nema vidljivosti okolo nikakve.
Sad će tebi teleskop na njemu kad nemaš kupole da mi može.
A pa, čuj šta će mi. Pa treba mi. Ne moram imati kupolje, ja trebam da spotam nekoga ovdje kada se približi, onda idemo dalje. Još ti kod nas kockica, znači tamo je otišla naprijed, ovdje. Light i kockica, a heavy iza stoji pola healtha, crveni. KV1 je sa gornje strane na pol.
I ovdje taj strv zna isprat.
Kad bi znao, ali ne zna. Zato će sad KV1 popušti, strv će iza njega popušti, ja ću treći tamo gore popušti i to je to. Završena Karelia. Eno, znači, BDR ide IM Mitsu na kockicu. Ubiše kockicu M31, a i ovaj je došao tamo, ne znam, koji mu je đavo da se tamo penji. Dobro, Jeff, kako se pojavio i nestao odmah? Znači, Bože,
Moram ići.
vrti mi.
Prema spot.
Ništa, ajde, ako te spotaju ljudi, onda idi.
Ja. Pozdrav. Ja malo.
Ajde, pozdrav.
To difficult problems, rather than honest acknowledgements of trade-offs and limitations that realistic policy making requires. Meanwhile, leaders who provide realistic assessments of policy challenges may find themselves defeated by demagogues who promise simple solutions to complex problems, regardless of whether those solutions can actually work. This creates incentives for strategic communication that emphasizes benefits while downplaying costs, that attributes failures to external enemies rather than inherent difficulties, and that promises more than can realistically be delivered. The result may be electoral success for leaders who understand popular psychology, but also systematic deception that undermines the informed consent that democratic legitimacy supposedly requires. The relationship between popular opinion and expert knowledge illustrates another fundamental challenge in democratic governance that Machiavellian analysis helps illuminate. Effective policy making often requires technical expertise about complex subjects that most citizens cannot reasonably be expected to master. But democratic legitimacy requires that major policy decisions ultimately reflect popular preferences rather than expert judgment. This creates potential conflicts between what experts know to be necessary or effective and what citizens are willing to support through democratic processes. Citizens may demand policies that experts know will fail, or they may resist policies that experts know are necessary for addressing serious problems. Democratic leaders must therefore develop strategies for building popular support for expert-recommended policies without appearing to ignore or manipulate democratic opinion. This might involve educational campaigns that help citizens understand technical issues, consultation processes that give citizens meaningful influence over expert decisions, or institutional arrangements that insulate certain policy areas from direct democratic control while maintaining overall democratic accountability. Modern examples include central bank independence, scientific advisory committees, and various forms of deliberative democracy that attempt to combine expert knowledge with popular participation. The goal is not to eliminate either popular influence or expert input, but rather to find institutional arrangements that allow both to contribute effectively to policy-making processes. The strategic dimensions of opinion management reveal how skilled political leaders can shape popular sentiment to support necessary policies while maintaining democratic legitimacy and avoiding outright deception. Effective political communication involves framing complex issues in ways that make necessary policies appear consistent with popular values and interests, rather than requiring citizens to accept policies that conflict with their basic preferences. This might involve emphasizing certain aspects of policy proposals while de-emphasizing others, connecting policy arguments to widely shared values and experiences, or timing policy announcements to take advantage of favorable political circumstances. It might also involve building coalitions that demonstrate popular support for particular policies, creating visible policy successes that build credibility for more ambitious proposals, or gradually introducing controversial ideas through incremental steps that allow public opinion to adjust over time. These strategic approaches require sophisticated understanding of popular psychology and considerable political skill, but they allow democratic leaders to govern effectively without systematically deceiving their constituents. The key insight is that honest governance does not require complete transparency about every aspect of policy making, but rather requires ensuring that popular consent is based on adequate understanding of fundamental choices and trade-offs, rather than on false premises or impossible promises. The institutional mechanisms for managing the relationship between leadership and opinion include various forms of representation, consultation, and accountability that attempt to balance responsiveness with effectiveness in democratic governance. Direct democracy through referendums and initiatives allows citizens to make policy decisions directly, but may produce outcomes that reflect temporary emotions rather than sustained deliberation about complex issues. Representative democracy through elected officials provides some insulation from popular volatility while maintaining democratic accountability, but it may create gaps between popular preferences and actual policy outcomes that undermine legitimacy. Various forms of deliberative democracy attempt to combine popular participation with structured discussion that improves the quality of democratic decision-making, but they may be too complex and time-consuming for routine policy-making. The optimal institutional arrangements depend on specific circumstances and policy areas, but they typically involve multiple mechanisms that provide different pathways for popular influence, while ensuring that democratic processes produce workable policy outcomes. Modern examples include citizen advisory committees, public comment processes for regulatory decisions, and various forms of participatory budgeting that give citizens direct influence over specific governmental decisions. Understanding these institutional options helps explain why some democratic societies manage the relationship between leadership and opinion more successfully than others, and why democratic governance requires ongoing institutional innovation rather than simply implementing fixed democratic procedures. The goal is not to achieve perfect alignment between popular opinion and policy outcomes, which is probably impossible in complex societies, but rather to ensure that democratic processes provide sufficient popular influence to maintain legitimacy while producing policy outcomes that actually address serious social problems effectively. Part 17. The geography of power, territory, borders and strategic space. The spatial dimensions of political power represent a crucial but often overlooked aspect of Machiavellian analysis that connects domestic governance to international relations, military strategy and economic development in ways that remain highly relevant for contemporary political analysis. Unlike approaches that treat territory simply as a backdrop for political action, Machiavellian geographical analysis examines how spatial factors shape political possibilities, create strategic advantages and vulnerabilities, and influence the effectiveness of different governmental approaches. His insights about territorial control, border management, and the relationship between geography and political institutions anticipate modern theories of geopolitics, regional development, and spatial economics that continue to influence military planning, international relations, and domestic policy analysis. But his analysis also reveals how geographical factors interact with human institutions and technological capabilities to create constantly evolving strategic environments that require adaptive responses from political leaders. Understanding these geographical dimensions becomes crucial for anyone involved in national security planning, regional development, or international relations, where spatial factors create both opportunities and constraints that affect political outcomes. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian geographical analysis extends to ongoing debates about globalization, climate change, and technological disruption that are altering traditional relationships between territory and political power in ways that require new forms of strategic thinking. The foundation of Machiavellian geographical analysis rests on his observation that territorial control represents the most fundamental requirement for political authority, but that effective territorial control requires more than simply occupying physical space. Political territories must be defended against external threats, administered through governmental institutions, and integrated economically and culturally to create genuine political communities rather than merely occupied zones. These requirements create different challenges depending on geographical characteristics, such as size, shape, topography, climate, natural resources, and location relative to other political entities. Small territories may be easier to defend and administer, but may lack the resources necessary for political independence, while large territories may possess greater resources but may be more difficult to integrate and defend effectively. Geographical features, such as mountains, rivers, and coastlines, create natural boundaries that may facilitate defense and administration, but they may also create internal divisions that complicate political integration. Meanwhile, geographical location relative to trade routes, natural resources, and other political entities creates strategic opportunities and vulnerabilities that affect foreign policy options and domestic development possibilities. The relationship between territorial expansion and political stability illustrates one of the most important insights in Machiavellian strategic analysis. Territorial expansion can provide access to additional resources, eliminate external threats, and demonstrate governmental strength in ways that build domestic legitimacy and international prestige. But expansion also creates new administrative burdens, defense obligations, and potential sources of conflict that may exceed the benefits of additional territory. The optimal territorial size for any political entity depends on its institutional capabilities, available technology, and strategic environment, rather than on abstract principles about expansion or isolation. Historical examples demonstrate that both excessive expansion and excessive isolation can create fatal vulnerabilities, while the most successful political entities tend to expand gradually in ways that allow their institutions to adapt to new territorial responsibilities. Modern examples include the challenges facing federal systems that must balance local autonomy with national integration, the difficulties associated with nation building in occupied territories, and the trade-offs between economic integration and political sovereignty in international organizations. The strategic dimensions of border management reveal how geographical boundaries interact with political institutions to create security challenges and opportunities that require ongoing attention from political leaders. Effective borders must be defensible against military threats, controllable for administrative purposes, and permeable enough to allow beneficial economic and cultural exchanges while preventing harmful infiltration. These multiple requirements often conflict with each other and require sophisticated institutional arrangements that can adapt to changing circumstances and threat environments. Natural geographical features may provide some defensive advantages, but they rarely correspond exactly to optimal political boundaries for administrative or economic purposes. Meanwhile, technological changes constantly alter the strategic value of particular geographical features and create new possibilities for both defense and attack that require corresponding adjustments in border management strategies. Modern examples include the impact of aviation on traditional geographical barriers, the role of cyber warfare in transcending physical boundaries, and the challenges created by climate change for existing border arrangements. The economic geography of political power illustrates how spatial factors interact with trade patterns, resource distribution and technological capabilities to create constraints and opportunities for domestic and international policy. Political entities that control strategically important geographical features such as harbours, mountain passes or river systems may be able to extract economic benefits from their geographical advantages, while those in less favourable locations may face systematic disadvantages. But geographical advantages can be enhanced or offset by institutional capabilities, technological innovations, and strategic alliances that allow political entities to transcend their immediate geographical limitations. The development of transportation and communication technologies constantly alters the strategic value of different geographical features and creates new possibilities for economic and political integration across traditional geographical barriers. Modern examples include the impact of containerization on port cities, the role of digital technologies in enabling remote economic activities, and the strategic importance of rare earth mineral deposits for technological development. Understanding these dynamic relationships helps explain why some geographical regions experience sustained economic and political success, while others remain marginalized despite apparent natural advantages. The cultural and psychological dimensions of territorial identity reveal how geographical spaces become invested with political meaning that affects citizen loyalty, national identity, and international legitimacy in ways that extend far beyond purely strategic considerations. Territories that are perceived as historical homelands, sacred
Thanks
spaces,
fucking a
or
lot.
essential
Kada
parts of national
opet kocke
identity
idu
generate
naprijed,
stronger
pametno,
emotional
pametno,
attachments
vrlo
and political
pametno.
support
A lajti nazad
than
ide,
territories
znači
that are
povlači
viewed as
se, a
merely
kocka ne
strategic
ostaje
assets of
tamo.
economic resources.
Sakrio je
These
ime da se ne
emotional
zna da je
attachments can
debilčina.
provide powerful resources for political mobilization and military resistance, but they can also create obstacles to rational strategic planning and peaceful conflict resolution. Meanwhile, territories with diverse populations, contested historical claims, or weak cultural integration may require different governmental approaches than territories with homogeneous populations and strong shared identities. The challenge for political leaders involves building sufficient territorial loyalty to maintain political cohesion while avoiding the kind of geographical
Hoćemo i čekati koji neće ni doći ili ćemo ići okolo, znači pušati.
with neighboring political entities. Modern examples include the role of territorial disputes in international conflicts, the challenges facing multicultural societies,
Bishop
with
napada
competing
direktno.
territorial claims, and the impact of migration and globalization on traditional
Znači,
territorial
Bože.
identities. Understanding these cultural dimensions helps explain why territorial conflicts often prove more difficult to resolve than purely strategic or economic disputes, and why effective territorial governance requires attention to symbolic and psychological factors as well as administrative and military considerations. The goal is not to eliminate territorial attachments, which provide important sources of political identity and social cohesion, but rather to manage them in ways that strengthen political communities while avoiding destructive conflicts over geographical boundaries. Part 18.
Kako se ne vidi kad
Corruption
ne
and the decay
izađe
of
iza
political
nečega.
virtue. The analysis of political corruption represents one of Machiavelli's most sophisticated contributions to understanding how political systems degenerate over time and lose the capacity for effective governance. Unlike approaches that treat corruption simply as individual moral failure or criminal behavior, Machiavellian corruption analysis examines the systemic conditions that make corrupt behavior rational.
Daj me, tako jebi me, znači.
His insights about
Ne znaš ići na vrijeme naprijed,
institutional
Bog te nas.
design, social
A
conditions,
i ja idem,
and
jebote,
corrupt
sunce začkaj u bazi, boli te
continue to
briga,
influence
znači šta se
contemporary
dešava.
research on governance quality, economic development, and democratic consolidation around the world. But his analysis also reveals why corruption problems cannot be solved simply through better laws or moral education, since corruption often represents a symptom of deeper institutional failures that require more fundamental reforms. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in institutional reform, economic development, or anti-corruption efforts in contexts where existing institutions have become captured by particular interests or where social conditions make honest governance difficult to sustain. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian corruption analysis extends to ongoing challenges in both developed and developing countries, where various forms of political corruption continue to undermine governmental effectiveness and democratic legitimacy. The foundation of Machiavellian corruption analysis rests on his distinction between individual corruption that involves specific acts of dishonesty or abuse of power and systemic corruption that involves the breakdown of institutional norms and procedures that normally constrain self-interested behavior. Individual corruption can occur in any political system and may be addressed through better monitoring, enforcement, and punishment of specific violations. But systemic corruption involves the erosion of shared expectations about appropriate behavior that makes corrupt practices normal and expected rather than exceptional and punishable. When corruption becomes systemic, honest behavior becomes disadvantageous because those who follow official rules and procedures find themselves unable to compete effectively with those who ignore institutional constraints. This creates what economists call a corruption equilibrium, where everyone has incentives to engage in corrupt behavior regardless of their personal moral preferences. Breaking out of corruption equilibria requires coordinated changes in institutional arrangements, enforcement mechanisms, and social expectations that go far beyond prosecuting individual corrupt actors. The relationship between economic inequality and political corruption illustrates how social conditions interact with institutional design to create environments that either support or undermine honest governance. Extreme economic inequality creates incentives for wealthy individuals and organizations
To bi bilo to od mene,
to
sad mogu da se
purchase political
slikam.
influence through
Za 15
various
helta.
forms of corruption. While it also
Kada
creates
pogrešno
incentives
pogledaju,
for
znači
poorly paid
ubiće
public
me.
officials to supplement their incomes
Jer se
through
jebene
corrupt
debilčine
practices.
neće da se prodaju, znači za 10
Meanwhile,
helta.
economic inequality may reduce the political influence of middle-class groups who typically provide the strongest constituency for honest government and institutional reform. When economic elites can achieve their policy objectives through corruption rather than through
Ljebe, dragi.
they have little incentive to support institutional reforms that would make government more responsive to broader public interests. Similarly, when public officials cannot support their families on official salaries, they may view corrupt practices as necessary survival strategies rather than as moral failures. Addressing systemic corruption therefore requires attention to underlying economic conditions, as well as to formal institutional arrangements and enforcement mechanisms. Modern examples include the relationship between natural resource wealth and governance quality, the impact of globalization on regulatory capture, and the role of economic development in supporting democratic consolidation.
Strašno.
Understanding these relationships helps explain why anti-corruption efforts often fail when they focus exclusively on law enforcement, rather than addressing broader social and economic conditions that make corruption rational and profitable. The institutional mechanisms that either facilitate or constrain corrupt behavior reveal how different governmental arrangements create different incentives for honest versus dishonest conduct among public officials. Institutions that concentrate power in few hands without effective oversight create opportunities for corruption, while institutions that distribute power among multiple actors with conflicting interests create natural checks against corrupt behavior. But excessive fragmentation of authority may also create corruption opportunities by making it difficult to assign responsibility for specific decisions and by creating multiple veto points that corrupt actors can exploit. The optimal institutional arrangements depend on broader social conditions, technological capabilities, and cultural norms that affect how different institutional designs function in practice. Transparency mechanisms that provide public access to governmental information can help constrain corruption by making corrupt behavior more visible and politically costly. But transparency alone may not be sufficient when civil society lacks the capacity to monitor government effectively, or when media institutions are themselves corrupted. Similarly, competitive elections can provide incentives for honest government by allowing voters to punish corrupt officials, but electoral competition may also create incentives for campaign finance violations and other forms of political corruption when campaign costs exceed the resources that candidates can raise through legitimate means. The international dimensions of corruption create additional challenges for anti-corruption efforts that domestic institutional reforms alone cannot address effectively. Globalization has created opportunities for corrupt actors to hide assets in foreign jurisdictions, to use international financial systems to launder corrupt proceeds, and to exploit differences between national legal systems to avoid prosecution. Meanwhile, international economic competition may create pressures for regulatory races to the bottom, where countries weaken anti-corruption standards to attract foreign investment or to support domestic businesses in international markets. Multinational corporations may engage in corrupt practices in countries with weak governance while maintaining clean reputations in their home countries, creating double standards that undermine global anti-corruption efforts. Addressing these international dimensions requires coordination among multiple countries and international organizations that may have conflicting interests and different approaches to corruption control. Modern examples include international efforts to combat money laundering, tax avoidance, and bribery in international business transactions that require complex multilateral cooperation and enforcement mechanisms. The cultural and psychological dimensions of corruption reveal how social norms and individual attitudes interact with institutional arrangements to create environments that either support or undermine honest governance. Societies with strong traditions of civic engagement, social trust, and respect for law tend to experience less corruption than societies where such norms are weak or absent. But cultural norms can change over time in response to institutional experiences and social conditions, which means that corruption problems can become self-reinforcing as corrupt practices undermine social trust and civic engagement. Similarly, individual attitudes toward corruption may depend on perceptions of fairness, effectiveness and legitimacy in governmental institutions rather than simply on abstract moral principles.
Ajde i ti sada kad je krenulo te.
People who believe that governmental institutions serve only elite interests may view corruption as acceptable or even justified, while people who believe that institutions serve broader public purposes may be more willing to
Dajem
support
piksel jedan da
anti-corruption
pokušavam.
efforts. This suggests that anti-corruption strategies must address issues of political legitimacy and institutional performance, as well as specific corrupt practices,
Dobro.
if they hope to achieve sustainable improvements in governance quality. The goal is not simply to eliminate corrupt behavior,
Što nisam samo
which may
skočio
be
tu.
impossible in complex societies, but rather to create institutional environments where honest behavior serves individual interests, while corrupt behavior carries sufficient costs to discourage systematic abuse of public office. This requires ongoing attention to institutional maintenance and renewal, rather than simply establishing anti-corruption laws and assuming they will enforce themselves automatically. Part 19. The relationship between knowledge and power. The intersection of intellectual authority and political authority represents one of the most complex and enduring challenges in political life that Machiavelli analyzed with characteristic realism and psychological insight. Unlike traditional approaches that either subordinate politics to philosophical truth or dismiss intellectual considerations as irrelevant to practical governance, Machiavellian analysis examines how different types of knowledge interact with political power to create both opportunities and dangers for effective leadership. His insights about the political utility of expertise,
Kako?
the limitations of
Odakle?
theoretical knowledge, and the relationship between intellectual independence and political effectiveness continue to influence debates about technocratic
Kome je mogo
governance,
spotati odakle?
scientific
Bog te
advice
jebo.
and policymaking, and the role of universities in democratic societies. But his analysis also reveals why purely intellectual approaches to political problems often fail,
Vidi ovo.
and why
Vidi
successful
ovo, Bog
political
te
leadership
mazo.
requires different capabilities than those that generate intellectual achievement. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in policy making, academic research, or various forms of expertise that aim to
Jebote,
influence
Rejneme
political
Juze.
decisions in complex modern
Spota me
societies.
nešto, znači...
The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian knowledge analysis extends to ongoing debates about evidence-based policy, artificial intelligence in governance, and various forms of information warfare that exploit the same tensions between intellectual authority and popular legitimacy that he identified centuries ago. The foundation of Machiavellian knowledge analysis rests on his distinction between speculative knowledge that seeks truth for its own sake and practical knowledge that seeks effective action in specific circumstances. Speculative knowledge involves theoretical understanding of universal principles that remain constant
Lebe.
across different contexts and time periods, while practical knowledge involves contextual judgment about what will work in particular situations given existing constraints and opportunities. Both types of knowledge provide valuable resources for political decision-making, but they operate according to different criteria and may generate conflicting recommendations about appropriate action. Speculative knowledge emphasizes logical consistency, empirical accuracy, and theoretical elegance that may not translate directly into effective policy recommendations. Practical knowledge emphasizes workability,
Pardon.
political feasibility, and adaptive capacity that may require compromising theoretical purity for the sake of concrete results. Effective political leadership requires the ability to draw on both types of knowledge while understanding their respective limitations and appropriate spheres of application. The political utility of expertise illustrates how specialized knowledge can enhance governmental effectiveness while also creating new sources of political vulnerability and conflict. Technical expertise about complex subjects such as economics, public health, engineering, and military strategy can improve policy outcomes by providing more accurate information about cause and effect relationships and by identifying policy options that non-experts might miss. But expertise also creates dependencies on specialists who may have their own interests and biases that conflict with broader public purposes. And it may undermine democratic legitimacy when expert recommendations conflict with popular preferences. The challenge for political leaders involves harnessing expert knowledge effectively while maintaining democratic accountability and avoiding capture by narrow technical perspectives that ignore important political and social considerations. This requires institutional arrangements that provide access to expert advice while preserving political authority to make final decisions based on broader considerations than technical expertise alone can provide. Modern examples include scientific advisory committees, independent regulatory agencies, and various forms of evidence-based policy making that attempt to combine expert knowledge with democratic governance. The limitations of theoretical knowledge in political contexts reflect fundamental differences between the controlled environments where theories are developed and tested and the complex, dynamic environments where political decisions must be made. Theoretical models necessarily simplify reality to make analysis possible, but political situations often involve precisely the kinds of complexity, uncertainty, and value conflicts that theoretical simplification eliminates. Meanwhile, theoretical knowledge often focuses on optimal solutions under ideal conditions rather than on workable solutions under existing constraints and with available resources. This can create gaps between theoretical recommendations and practical possibilities that make purely academic approaches to policy problems ineffective or counterproductive. Effective political leadership requires the ability to translate theoretical insights into practical strategies while adapting to circumstances that theoretical models cannot fully anticipate or control. This translation process requires different skills than those needed for theoretical analysis, including political judgment, negotiation ability, and sensitivity to implementation challenges that academic training may not provide. The relationship between intellectual independence and political effectiveness creates ongoing tensions for scholars, policy experts, and other knowledge producers who wish to influence political decisions while maintaining their intellectual integrity. Intellectual work requires freedom to pursue questions wherever they lead and to reach conclusions based on evidence and logic rather than on political convenience or popular opinion. But political effectiveness often requires adapting intellectual conclusions to political realities, building coalitions among groups with different interests and values, and accepting compromise solutions that fall short of intellectually optimal outcomes. Scholars who maintain complete intellectual independence may produce work that is intellectually valuable but politically irrelevant, while those who adapt their work too extensively to political requirements may compromise their intellectual credibility and long-term effectiveness. Finding appropriate balances between intellectual independence and political engagement requires sophisticated understanding of both intellectual and political processes, as well as clear thinking about the different types of contributions that intellectual work can make to political life. Modern examples include the role of think tanks in policy making, the relationship between universities and government agencies, and various forms of public intellectuals who attempt to bridge academic and political worlds. The strategic dimensions of knowledge in political competition reveal how information and expertise can become weapons in political conflicts, while also serving
idemo.
functions of improving
Rush me.
understanding and decision-making. Political actors may commission research, cite studies, and invoke expert authority not because they are genuinely seeking better information, but because doing so provides tactical advantages in political debates. This instrumental use of knowledge can distort both research processes and political discussions by creating incentives for producing conclusions that serve political purposes rather than advancing genuine understanding. Meanwhile, opponents may attack research credibility, question expert motives, or promote alternative experts who reach different conclusions, regardless of the actual quality of research or expertise involved. These dynamics can undermine public trust in expertise, while also reducing the actual utility of research and analysis for improving policy making. The challenge
Ajmo,
involves
Churchilla,
developing
idi bre
institutional
naprijed,
arrangements
jeboti,
that protect
mater
the
svoju.
integrity of research and analysis while allowing
Šta
their
stojiš iza,
insights to
čekaš,
influence
Bog te
political
mazo.
processes in constructive ways. This might involve independent research institutions, transparent peer review processes, and various forms of science communication that help non-experts evaluate competing knowledge claims more effectively. The goal is not to insulate knowledge production completely from political influence, which would reduce its relevance for practical problems, but rather to ensure that political considerations enhance rather than distort the knowledge production process. Part 20. Machiavelli's legacy and the future of political realism. The enduring
Dobit će
influence
nas
of
na kraju
Machiavellian
Bog.
political analysis extends far beyond the specific historical circumstances that shaped his original insights to provide a framework for understanding political dynamics that continues to evolve and adapt to new challenges facing contemporary societies. His fundamental contribution involves not any particular policy recommendation or institutional design, but rather a methodological approach to political analysis that prioritizes empirical observation over theoretical assumption and practical effectiveness over moral idealism. This methodological legacy has influenced fields ranging from international relations theory to organizational psychology to strategic management, creating intellectual tools that remain relevant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. But his legacy also includes unresolved tensions and ongoing debates about the relationship between political effectiveness and moral legitimacy that continue to challenge democratic societies around the world. Understanding this legacy becomes crucial for anyone seeking to apply Machiavellian insights to contemporary political challenges while avoiding the dangers of crude manipulation or amoral pragmatism that have sometimes been associated with his approach. The future development of political realism must address both the continuing relevance and the inherent limitations of Machiavellian analysis in contexts that he could not have anticipated, but that share fundamental characteristics with the political environments he studied. Strategized comprehensive conclusion for final analytical section dot. This is the final part, so I need to make sure it provides a comprehensive conclusion that ties together all the major themes while also looking forward to contemporary applications and future developments. Let me structure this to cover the methodological legacy and core insights, contemporary applications and relevance, unresolved tensions and criticisms, future developments and adaptations, final assessment of the
jedan mi
enduring
valio.
depth,
Jebi ga.
and pause
Eno ga iza leđa
while
došao.
providing a satisfying conclusion to the
Mali
entire
brzac.
analysis dot.
Mali brzac.
The methodological revolution that
base
Machiavelli
capture. Fuck off.
initiated continues to shape how scholars and practitioners approach political analysis by insisting on the priority of empirical observation over theoretical elegance, or moral wishful thinking. His commitment to studying politics as it actually operates, rather than as we wish it would operate, has become the foundation for modern social science methodology across multiple disciplines. This empirical approach generates insights that often challenge conventional wisdom and comfortable assumptions about human nature, institutional effectiveness, and the possibilities for political reform. But it also provides more reliable guidance for practical action, because it begins with accurate understanding of existing conditions rather than with idealized assumptions about how people and institutions should behave. The methodological legacy includes not just specific analytical techniques.